Mom, can I have some money to buy a Satan-worshipping, suicide-advocating heavy metal album? Calvin, the fact that these bands haven't killed themselves in ritual self-sacrifice shows that they're just in it for the money like everyone else. It's all for effect. If you want to shock and provoke, be sincere about it. Mainstream commercial nihilism can't be trusted? Afraid not, kiddo. Childhood is so disillusioning. Lords of Chaos is a 2018 film directed by Jonas Akerlund, adapted from the 1998 book of the same name. It's a dramatization of the story of Norwegian black metal legends Mayhem and the culture they inadvertently spawned over the course of band leader Euronymous' tumultuous life, which infamously ended in tragedy. The book, while certainly engaging, is also not something I can recommend to literally anyone due to Michael Moynihan, the book's co-writer, being all but confirmed to be a Nazi. He's repeatedly denied these allegations, but so has nearly every white supremacist in the public sphere since the end of the Third Reich. In any case, the book isn't great. It's very uneven. Its distance to the subjects almost leaps off the page at you. And while the events presented are true, or as true as a dramatization can inherently be, they're presented with a bit more of a morally questionable slant than they should be, owing, again, to Moynihan's Nazi sympathies bleeding through to one of the book's subjects, Varg Vikernes. But we'll come back to him later. But while the book might not be something I'd endorse, the film adaptation is honestly one of my favorite movies at this point. It's not perfect, but it's one of the best encapsulations of a subculture in all its best and worst notions. It turns the already uniquely chaotic story of Mayhem into a riveting, unendingly sad, and sardonic thriller that feels too raw to be fiction yet too dramatically juicy to be real. While the book covers many bands in the black metal scene at the time, the film focuses its lens to an even more microscopic level and tells the story of Mayhem from the perspective of Euronymous. For those unaware, Mayhem were, from their very inception, a historically fraught band, and that was by design. Mayhem was a band designed to push so far past the boundaries of what was considered tasteful that their music would only appeal to the people on the absolute bleeding edge of a niche counterculture, and by virtue of that specificity, their fanbase was die-hard and tight-knit. Mayhem were a pioneer in what Euronymous repeatedly refers to as true Norwegian black metal, a subculture notable for spawning some of the best music and most deranged musicians metal has to offer. Now, Mayhem didn't invent black metal. That was Venom, Hellhammer, and or Bathory, depending on who you ask, but they hugely contributed to the genre as we know it today. They have a couple projects that are considered downright essentials in the genre, and the community that built out around them went on to also make utterly iconic staples of not just black metal, but metal in general. The influence of this band cannot be overstated, but I'd be lying if I said that people were ever just into Mayhem for their music. See, Mayhem was, at their core, a very let's say, troubled band. From the start, the band members clearly had a lot of mental problems, as is shown in graphic detail in the film. The band's first lead singer, Dead, that's his name, was incredibly depressive, known for his incredibly morbid interests. The film portrays Dead as the member of Mayhem most starkly dedicated to shock, from enclosing a crucified mouse in the package with his demo tape, to playing with roadkill, to onstage wrist cutting. The film also portrays him as having killed cats, which is one detail that's pretty much confirmed to be inaccurate and an embellishment on the filmmaker's part, as well as one I'm not too keen on given the film is relatively light on indulging the edginess it portrays, but I digress. Tragically, Dead's constant acts of self-destruction would reach an ugly conclusion when he was found dead by suicide at the age of 22 on April 8th, 1991. I do need to warn you. Lords of Chaos portrays said suicide in graphic detail. The resulting scene is suffocatingly powerful. My eyes were recording tears, but I do want to make it clear that if you're thinking about watching this movie, do not do so on a whim. There's a lot of material that's potentially triggering if you're someone who also deals with these thoughts. With that being said, if you know much at all about this band, you know what came next. Euronymous, upon finding Dead's corpse, ran out to purchase a disposable camera and had a photo shoot with the remainder of Dead. He only called for help afterwards. And instead of burning the photos like his bandmates told him to, he did not. And one of these photos was later used as cover art for the bootleg live album, The Dawn of the Black Hearts. It should go without saying that it's not a pleasant image, so I won't be showing it to you, but it's a real thing that exists and is freely accessible. You can even own it for yourself on vinyl. Boy, I love metal. These photos, as well as necklaces that Euronymous purportedly made from bits of Dead's skull, drives Necrobutcher, the band's bassist, to, understandably, quit the band. With the future of the band sitting in limbo, Euronymous starts a record label and an accompanying record store, which quickly becomes the hotspot for like-minded metalheads. While a variety of great bands stem from the scene, such as Immortal and Darkthrone, the film shines a light on two pivotal figures to Euronymous' life and the scene as a whole, those being Faust, the drummer of Emperor, and Varg Vikernes, the man who would go on to make music as Burzum. as well as replace Necro Butcher for a short while as the bassist in Mayhem. These two figures are quick to contrast with Euronymous, who at this point has been the ringleader in the inner circle of the scene. See, while Euronymous is pretty blatantly not a good person, he's also a very internally scared one and tends to talk big without backing it up. In the movie, he makes flippant comments about church burning and stabbing to Varg and Faust respectively, which he later takes credit for after they, well, burned down a church and killed a man. While Euronymous might not have known it at the time, the subculture he was a part of, the subculture he helped pioneer, was attracting some genuinely dangerous people, and those people were what eventually led to his downfall. Yet, until the very end, he refused to come clean. He joined in on the attacks. He bragged about the achievements the inner circle had made, and he shows little to no remorse for any of it. Just because Euronymous was more hesitant than his colleagues doesn't make him any less complicit. Anyhow, yes, Varg burns down a church. A lot of churches, in fact, way more than the film shows. He does this seemingly out of a mix of resentment of religion and a want to be liked by Euronymous, a want to impress him, but also to challenge him. Euronymous talks a lot about being evil and lambasts quote-unquote posers who aren't as committed to the bit, but Varg calls him out on his bluff. Varg brags about his commitment. Varg leads by example, and Euronymous, while seeming to handle it gracefully in the moment, starts cracking. While he joins Varg for a couple more church burnings to prove he too is capable of evil, the film starts developing Euronymous more as a person outside of his persona. He gets a girlfriend, and around her he starts to feel more like an actual human being. Oddball, and slightly elitist, but quick-witted and passionate. I really like how much the film shows him in relation to women. He has a couple scenes with his little sister early in the film that establish a little more humanity than his peers. He is a tragic figure in many ways, haunted by dead, and remorseful of what he did, all in the name of shock value. Rory Culkin plays Euronymous wonderfully. He's as bratty and misanthropic and downright mean as you'd expect, but also backs all his words with an aura of posturing. There's a melancholy to him. There's a notion that no matter how terrible the things he does and says are, he doesn't really mean them. He's just running away from bigger problems. Varg, on the other hand, is a complete fucking lunatic, played to perfection by Emery Cohen. He looks up to Euronymous. He idolizes him to the point of stalking, and yet once Euronymous acknowledges and accredits his existence, Varg realizes that the person he invested so much time caring about into doesn't care about the same things he does. At least, the same way he does. Lords of Chaos released in 2018, which I feel was immaculate timing given the rise of the alt-right and the return of open, unabashed white supremacy we've seen in the past decade or so. I see a lot of parallels between the right-wing grifter-acolyte dynamic and Euronymous' relationship with Varg. Someone saying outlandishly terrible things just to get attention when they don't mean it, but in doing so attracting someone who fully agrees. And to get this out of the way, Varg is a Nazi. This is not a point of debate. He is one of the most ideologically heinous people I've ever read about, and the fact that he was allowed to remain on YouTube for years spreading his hateful rhetoric still makes my blood boil. He's also a murderer who should still be in prison, but I'll get to that in a bit. The inner circle's undoing starts in large part due to that other important guy I mentioned earlier, Faust. As I also mentioned, Faust killed a man. Another brutal sequence in the film I feel compelled to warn people of is this very murder sequence. As Faust goes into a bar, the specific one was a gay hotspot, leads a man on, takes him outside and behind some trees, and, seemingly on a whim, stabs him repeatedly to death. It is prolonged and not fun to watch, and while Faust is apparently not homophobic and says the killing was just for the sake of it, since when has killing for killing's sake been an acceptable reason to murder someone? If nothing else, it speaks to how normalized the murder of queer people was and still is. At the time, even the president was getting in on it. Anyways, this murder obviously gets cops involved, which, combined with the recent wave of church burnings, means Euronymous' store has to shut down and Varg gets arrested. The cops let him go due to lack of evidence, even though it's painfully obvious to everyone and confirmed by Varg everywhere outside of the cops that he's behind the burnings. Euronymous delivers the ugly truth to Varg, that he didn't ever mean the violent things he said and that it was all an image. He attempts to wrap things up with Varg and move on with his life, sending him a contract that transfers all of Varg's music from Euronymous' label's ownership to Varg's. But having gotten whiff of some offhand ranting Euronymous did about wanting to kill him, and already seething from having his true persona being revealed, Varg drives to Euronymous' house in the middle of the night, signs the contract he mailed him in front of him, and then Varg stabs Euronymous to death. And that's where Mayhem, as we knew it, died. And that's Lords of Chaos. I honestly didn't have to take you through the whole story, but it's so bizarre and compelling that I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice not to fill you in. And, while it's not perfect, I think this movie is great, and if you can handle it, well worth a watch. Not just because it's such a captivating story, but because it's intensely critical of its subjects. You know the guy who directed Lords of Chaos? Jonas Akerlund? He was the original drummer in Bathory, aka the band that made black metal. Now, he wasn't in the band for long, in fact he's on none of their studio albums, but I do think it lends the movie a certain authenticity, and it uses that authenticity to retroactively say, hey, we were fucking morons when we were kids. See, Lords of Chaos is kind of a polarizing movie in the metal sphere, because it's ready and willing to mock the subculture it's portraying. While some metalheads are willing to engage with some nuance even at their own expense, others really, really hate how Lords of Chaos portrays them. One of the many harsh truths the film displays is how metal is used as a form of teenage rebellion and escapism, rallying against the status quo seemingly for the sake of it. Unlike punk culture, which from the start had a strong anarchist or else left-wing slant, metal culture, especially this Norwegian black metal scene, isn't writing and performing in protest of systemic violence and unjust hierarchies. Rather, they're writing and performing in protest of life, I guess? They really don't have much of an ideology beyond piss off as many people around us as we can, which they say is to please Satan, but come on guys. Every real Satanist knows that Satan wouldn't want that. The very internal culture that this scene cultivated resulted in a very narrow understanding of the world around them, which then reinforced the idea that said community is the only one to truly understand them. It's a cycle of abuse, a cycle only broken by the fact that the community's foremost figure was the very poser he supposedly fought against. The film indirectly captures the feeling of disillusionment better than almost any other piece of media I've ever seen. It's a long, cold look in the mirror that dares to ask, above anything, why any of this is even happening, much less why it needs to. And some metalheads won't like what they see in their reflection. They'd much rather continue committing themselves to the aesthetic of misery. But, while I can only speak for me, the mocking nature of Lords of Chaos actually helped me to understand metal as a subculture a lot better, as well as my relation to it. See, I've been, not lying to you, but definitely holding back a little. I am a big fat metalhead. I love metal. Bands like System of a Down, The Dillinger Escape Plan, Death, Converge, Acid Bath, all some of my very favorites. Hell, my favorite album of all time, Low Teens, is a metal album. I have favorites from across the board, be it heavy metal, thrash metal, sludge metal, groove metal, metalcore, mathcore, grindcore, nu metal, industrial metal, death metal, brutal death metal, stoner metal, symphonic metal, I guess. Okay, what the fuck is stenchcore? I'd be lying if I said I knew every subgenre inside and out. But the point is, I've listened to a lot of metal throughout my years, I still do, and as such, I've had to come to terms with the fact that metal, perhaps more than any genre, has a really rough history. And black metal's history, in specific, is really just nightmarishly bad. It's full of Nazis and murderers, and oftentimes both. To get into black metal is to get in the habit of vetting the absolute shit of whatever band you're thinking about buying a shirt of. And perhaps more than any other band I've had to do this with, I've struggled most with Mayhem. Because, let me be clear, De Mysterious Dumb Satanists is maybe the greatest metal album of all time, period. There is not a miss on it. It transports me to a completely foreign place every time I listen to it. It's as raw and scary as it is hauntingly beautiful. To this day, nearly 30 years after its release, nothing sounds quite like it, and nothing really even comes close. It's also an album that features bass playing by Varg Vikernes, an album that's also the culmination of a rampage from what could very well be called a hate group. It's a painful album, both in the music and the context of the band. It's not something I can listen to every day, but it is absolutely worth listening to. But I still struggle with Mayhem as a band. I wear pretty much nothing but band shirts in my day-to-day life, and I've often thought about getting a Mayhem shirt given my love of their music and my interest in their story, as well as just having a pretty sick logo. And I never have. I've had many opportunities to. There's plenty of artists on Redbubble who sell great stuff, and paying them means I wouldn't be directly supporting the band, even though at this point the band's lineup is, to my knowledge, no longer tainted with Nazis. But nobody thinks of recent Mayhem when they see the name. They think of that first album and the baggage that comes with it. Even when I have the metaphorical all clear, I haven't bought one, because the last thing I want to be associated with in any capacity is Nazism. It is not that much of a sacrifice on my part to not buy a shirt. I would rather wear a shirt featuring a band that doesn't carry the capacity to make people of color uncomfortable around me. But as always, this is symbolic of a larger conversation, that being the art versus artist debate and the growing discussion around ethically enjoying excellent art. Now, the art versus artist video essay is practically a cliche at this point. It's well-tread ground, and even when they come from different places, everyone seems to reach the same conclusion. Take it on a case-by-case basis. Certainly don't feel bad for still liking said art, but generally don't financially support bad people. And, well, yes, I do agree with this, but I've always been a little frustrated with this discussion. Not just because it filters the terrible actions of said artist only through the lens of the fans' enjoyment being affected, but also because, well, separating the art from the artist is not only a bad idea, but an objectively impossible one. especially in the context of music, where art is created by, at most, a small cluster of people. No matter how hard you try to divorce someone from said art, it's still inherently said person's art. And besides, when you take the art and artist hand in hand, it makes for better art analysis. There's simply more lenses to see the work through. Albums given added meaning in the context of their creator's discography. Lyrics given an added dimension of metaphor. This is to say nothing of the listener's own experiences, which in turn inform their perception of the work. Also, completely unrelated, but did you know Meteora by Linkin Park is a loose concept album about coming out as trans in an unsupportive household? Seeing the art with the artist is a bit of a double-edged sword, however, because, while it can, at its best, make art way better and add an entire new layer to your understanding of the artist's work, at its worst, you're never going to be able to go back to the art again because it lives in the shadow of the artist. It's a risk you have to be willing to take if you want to engage with any art ever, and while I can only speak for me, the results, while mostly wonderfully gratifying, I'd be lying if I said didn't occasionally burn me. While sometimes I can laugh and roll my eyes at things I learn, like the contradiction of System of a Down drummer John Dolmayan being a Trump supporter, or, well, anything new I learn about Azalea Banks, other times I just get sick to my stomach. Not just because of what I learned, but because there's a part of me that still doesn't want to let go of that art. Some artists I've found easy to let go. Some make it easy to let go of themselves. But some artists simply won't leave my brain no matter how much I try. Their work just sits there enticingly. It makes me feel like Adam and Eve. That story is about agency, about the ability to sin being what makes us human. And yet, I still feel guilty for listening to some of these artists. Ever since I hit puberty, I've dealt with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. This has never truly gone away, and at my lowest, I've attempted suicide more than I'm comfortable admitting. Music, especially depressing, dark, and morbid music, was a source of comfort and catharsis for me during those times. Bands like Shoo Shoo, Joy Division, and Alice in Chains are still hugely important to me. And when I look at a lot of the music I feel bad for still listening to, I see a lot of stuff that was or still is a point of solace for me. If Mayhem wasn't bad enough for you, Silencer were literal Nazis who wrote some seriously anti-Semitic things in their work. And yet, despite hating the band and their disgusting ideologies, I still come back to their one album from time to time, because in spite of everything, there's nothing like it. It's one of the saddest and scariest albums I've ever heard. It made me feel things I'd never felt before when I first heard it, and it still retains that ability to shake me up to this day. And that's another thing I've noticed. I can't forget these albums because there's nothing else quite like them. Deftones guitarist recently came out as a flat earther, but even when I have a perfectly good Deftones ripoff to go to, I'd still choose White Pony in a heartbeat. Swans, who I once considered my favorite band, are fronted by Michael Jura, an alleged rapist, and that somehow just makes their music scarier. Playboi Carti recently got arrested for choking his pregnant girlfriend, and I'm still reluctantly excited to hear new music from him. And sometimes bands like Brand New and Sorority Noise come along, who were just so great at writing songs about feeling like a shit human being that certain members genuinely turned out to be. The worst part of that last one is, at least for Brand New, I knew that Jesse Lacey was a creep before I got into them, and I still fell for them. I think, at least in my experience, I go to media by shitty people when I want to feel human. There's a certain comfort in embracing art by bad people, or at the very least, accepting it. I can only go as far as I exist, and I know myself well enough to experience art responsibly. I obviously don't financially support any of these artists, and I think a lot of people feel this way too. It's impossible to cast one net upon all of humanity. We're all unique in one way or another, and so, while I can only confront my own tastes and biases, I'm going to do so. And if you're in the right headspace, I think you should too. And, with that, I like music made by Nazis. I like music made by abusers and rapists and murderers and pedophiles. I like music made by assholes and bigots and grifters. And I'm okay with that.
Fuck your faculty, your fans, and your music. Fuck the engineer and the nigga that produced it. Fuck your religion, your God, and your guidance. Still virgin every time I be surprised that I'm in. Fuck the moon, fuck the stars, fuck Venus and Mars. Fuck a Rolex and diamond ring with them flashy cars. Fuck the Last Supper, fuck your church and its gospel. Fuck them halfway dead niggas in the hospital. Fuck my left lung, fuck my right lung. Fuck my chrome gun, fuck my black gun. Fuck. Drop 5 bombs, fuck that. I'm on like the mic I record with. Fuck global warming, fuck heaven and hell. Purgatory, fuck the pastor. Fuck you for giving them offering. Fucking exhausted from all these fucks. I'm fucking off this nigga. What the fuck? Fuck money, fuck friends, fuck family. Fuck pussy, fuck drugs, fuck sanity.